Good night. Tonight's story takes us into the glittering world of the Gilded Age and Belle Époque, where beauty could open every door, wit could disarm the greatest minds, and a single whispered scandal could close a life forever. It is the story of a woman once hailed as the most beautiful of her generation, a muse to painters, sculptors, and poets. Admirers compared her to marble statues and lost themselves in the depths of her blue-green eyes. She dazzled salons in Paris, London, and Rome. And for a time, it seemed she might shape her destiny as surely as any queen. And yet, her life did not end in triumph. Somewhere along the way, the gilding cracked, and the bright promise of her youth curdled into something far darker. By the end, she was no longer remembered as the dazzling heiress of Europe, but as a ghost of her former self, a cautionary tale whispered with equal parts fascination and pity. How does one go from goddess to ghost? That is the story we'll drift through tonight. One of beauty, ambition, obsession, and downfall. So settle in, imagine the sparkle of chandeliers, the brush of silk skirts on marble floors, and the intoxicating sense that in these glittering rooms, perfection was not just desired, but demanded. Gladys Marie Deacon entered the world not in obscurity, but already surrounded by the trappings of privilege. She was born on February 7th, 1881, in Paris, at a moment when the city glittered as the jewel of Europe, the Belle Époque, a time of boulevards washed in gaslight, of carriages rolling past grand cafes, of waltzes played under gilded ceilings. Paris was not just a city then, it was a stage, and Gladys's family, wealthy American expatriates, knew how to take their place upon it. Her father, Edward Parker Deacon, was a prosperous Boston textile magnate. He belonged to that confident breed of American men who carried their fortunes abroad like passports, secure in the belief that money could open any door. Her mother, Florence Baldwin, was the daughter of Admiral Charles H. Baldwin, and her presence added pedigree to the mix. She was elegant, well-connected, and represented the kind of respectability that expat circles in Europe prize so highly. Together, Edward and Florence seemed to embody exactly what Americans abroad wanted to project: wealth, refinement, and impeccable social standing. Gladys was not an only child. She grew up surrounded by sisters, 3 in total, and together the Deacon girls formed a picture of privileged American girlhood in Europe. They were dressed in silks and lace, posed for photographs in immaculate white dresses with ribbons in their hair, and shepherded by governesses who ensured their manners were polished and their French perfect. In summers, the girls might be taken to the seaside, where they built sand castles on carefully selected beaches, always under the watchful eye of nursemaids. In winters, their lives were a carousel of lessons, piano practice, and outings to the parks of Paris. Gladys herself quickly stood out. From an early age, she displayed not only beauty, the famous blue-green eyes that would later enthrall half of Europe, but a startling quickness of mind. Tutors noted her precocious grasp of languages, her facility with memory, her curiosity about the world. One described her as a brain genius, which sounds like something a proud father might boast of at a dinner party, but which, in Gladys's case, seems to have been true. She absorbed knowledge the way other children absorbed nursery rhymes. By the time she was a teenager, she could converse in as many as 7 languages, and even as a little girl she gave off the impression of being sharper, quicker, and more willful than those around her. The family's position meant that Gladys's early years unfolded in a cocoon of elegance. Their Parisian life included spacious apartments with tall windows that opened onto boulevards, alive with the clatter of hooves and wheels. There were dinners with fine silver and crystal, visits to the opera, where Florence appeared in silk gowns, cut to the latest French fashion, and afternoons when Edward would proudly parade his daughters through the parks like exhibits of his domestic success. Children of wealthy expatriates were often raised half in the drawing room and half in the classroom. For Gladys and her sisters, this meant a steady diet of governesses, tutors, and convent schooling, with every expectation that they would grow into poised young women capable of navigating both American respectability and European sophistication. They learned to curtsy, to embroider, to play Chopin on the piano, and to carry on polite conversation in both French and English. If this sounds oppressive, remember, in the Belle Époque, being a girl of their class was essentially rehearsal for life on society's stage. But for all the careful polish, the Deacon household was not just about manners and lessons. There were also the small luxuries that made childhood sweet. Gladys adored animals, especially dogs, a passion that would stay with her and eventually overwhelm her life in ways both charming and tragic. She was given fine toys, dolls dressed in miniature couture, books bound in gilt leather, and a carousel of fashionable outfits that made her, even as a child, a small spectacle at the family's social gatherings. Servants bustled around the household, ensuring the girls were never without attention or comfort. The world they moved in was equally cosseted. The American colony in Paris was tight-knit, filled with wealthy families who sent their children to the same schools, visited the same resorts, and married into the same circles. These expatriates created a version of America abroad, one with all the money, but perhaps a little more refinement, courtesy of proximity to Europe's aristocracy. For Gladys, this meant playmates drawn from the ranks of little Vanderbilts, Astors and Whitneys, names that in America opened every door, and in Paris made their children glitter all the more. It is tempting to imagine that Gladys's childhood was one long pageant of charm and privilege, and for a while it was. Photographs from these years show a radiant little girl with eyes that already commanded attention, surrounded by sisters, her hair tied with ribbons, her expression more intense than one expects of a child. And indeed, there was something almost uncanny about her even then. Beauty and intelligence braided together in a way that made her stand out, even among the privileged daughters of her circle. But privilege has its cracks, and the Deacon family had more than most. Edward, for all his wealth, had a volatile temperament. Florence, for all her elegance, had her own restless desires. Their marriage, admired on the surface, was less secure behind closed doors. Gladys may not have understood this as a child, but children always sense the tensions in the air. Perhaps she noticed the arguments, the silences, the way her parents sometimes seemed more like adversaries than allies. For now the children were shielded by governesses, by the routines of study and play, by the endless distractions of Parisian society. But shadows were gathering. The world that had seemed so secure, the gaslit boulevards, the comfortable rituals of wealth, the carefully cultivated respectability, would not last. In February 1892, when Gladys was just 11 years old, everything changed. What happened in that winter month was so violent, so public, and so scandalous that it tore apart the cocoon of privilege forever. From that day forward, Gladys's name would never again be just that of a clever American girl in Paris. It would be tied to a headline-grabbing story that shocked Europe and marked her family forever. But for now, before the gunshots, before the headlines, before the whispered disgrace, Gladys was still the beloved daughter of a wealthy household, educated, indulged, and admired. She was still the clever girl of Parisian drawing rooms, with governesses correcting her grammar and playmates envying her dresses. She was still the child who collected languages as easily as dolls, and who looked out from her family's tall windows onto the shining boulevards of Paris with no idea that her charmed existence was about to crack apart. And that is perhaps the greatest cruelty of her story, that it began in such light before it fell into such darkness. Every gilded story has a crack, and for Gladys Deacon, that crack split wide open in the winter of 1892. Until then, her world had been all silk ribbons, governesses, and Parisian boulevards. And then in a single night at a fashionable French hotel, her father pulled a revolver and blasted her childhood apart. The hotel was the Hotel Splendide in Cannes, a place that lived up to its name. It was one of those establishments where the sheets were crisp, the dining room echoed with laughter in multiple languages, and the guest list was a who's who of wealthy Europeans and Americans trying to outdo one another in refinement. The Deacons were staying there when Edward Parker Deacon discovered what polite society had been whispering for months. His wife, Florence, was having an affair. Florence was beautiful, elegant, and restless. Edward was wealthy, proud, and increasingly volatile. It was hardly a surprising combination. Belle Époque Paris and the Riviera practically ran on extramarital affairs, whispered about in salons, shrugged at in private clubs. But Edward was an American abroad, and while some men might tolerate a discreet arrangement, Edward was not one of them. To him it was a matter of honour, of masculine pride, and perhaps of a temper that was already fraying. The lover was a young Frenchman named Émile Abbé, who seems to have had the misfortune of not hiding very well. On the night of February 19th, 1892, Edward stormed into Florence's apartment at the hotel. Accounts differ on the exact sequence, but the essentials are grimly theatrical. Edward broke down the door, revolver in hand. Abbé, caught in the act, tried to hide. Some reports say behind a sofa, others suggest he scrambled in panic across the room. It made no difference. Edward fired 3 shots. Abbé fell dead on the floor. It was a scene straight out of a French melodrama, except this one was real, and its echoes reverberated across the Atlantic. Within hours, the murder was the talk of Europe. Here was a wealthy American millionaire, supposedly the picture of refinement, revealed as a jealous, vengeful husband with a trigger finger. The international press had a field day. Headlines screamed of the splendid tragedy, and suddenly the Deacon name, once whispered with admiration in salons, was shouted in scandal sheets. Edward was arrested and charged with murder. The trial was a sensation. French courts, unused to such flamboyant American violence, found themselves the stage for a drama that combined wealth, sex, and blood, the 3 things guaranteed to sell newspapers. Florence was humiliated publicly, her affair dissected in painful detail. Edward's defence rested partly on outrage, the age-old excuse of a husband defending his honour, and partly on wealth and connections. And wealth, as it often did in the 19th century, proved more persuasive than justice. Edward's charge was reduced from murder to manslaughter, and his sentence, a mere 4 months in prison. 4 months for bursting into a hotel room and killing a man. To put that in perspective, in some modern cities you can serve longer than that for unpaid parking fines. For the Deacon children, the scandal was devastating. 11-year-old Gladys, already sensitive and precocious, suddenly found herself the daughter of a murderer and an adulteress. The cocoon of Parisian privilege split open, and in its place was the cold draught of humiliation. Children at school whispered, governesses gossiped, and the family name became synonymous with scandal. The divorce that followed in 1893 only poured salt on the wound. Florence was disgraced. Edward, despite being the convicted killer, somehow gained custody of the children, proof that patriarchy could sometimes outdo even scandal in its absurdity. For a time, Gladys was shuffled between convents, courts, and parental abductions. At one point, Florence kidnapped her own daughter from the convent where she'd been placed during Edward's imprisonment, sparking an international custody tug-of-war that only deepened the family's notoriety. Imagine the confusion for an 11-year-old. One day dressed in silk for piano practice, the next spirited away in secrecy because one parent feared losing her forever. It was less a childhood and more a serialised drama, each episode more bewildering than the last. And yet, as scandalous as it was, the damage went deeper still. Edward was not only disgraced but increasingly unstable. By the end of the decade, his mental health unravelled completely, culminating in his confinement to an asylum. He would die there in 1901, leaving behind both a fortune and a legacy of madness that haunted Gladys for the rest of her life. What did all this mean for Gladys? First, it meant she would never again be just another pretty American abroad. She was now the girl with a tragic backstory, the orphan of scandal, daughter of a man whose temper had killed, daughter of a woman whose desires had disgraced. Society loves such figures, the beautiful child touched by tragedy, whose very presence carries both glamour and shadow. For the rest of her life, Gladys's allure would be heightened by this early trauma, even as it quietly poisoned her sense of self. Dry humour. In today's terms, imagine being 11 years old, your parents going viral for the worst possible reasons, and everyone at school whispering about your dad's murder trial instead of your new shoes. It was scandal as social media spectacle, only without the mercy of algorithms burying the story after a few days. For Gladys, it never went away. By the time she was bundled off to America with her father in 1893, Gladys was no longer the carefree Parisian child of silken ribbons. She was already marked by scandal, by trauma, and by the heavy knowledge that wealth could buy you out of prison, but not out of humiliation. It is this wound, received so young, that explains much of what followed: the glittering beauty, the hunger for recognition, the obsession with perfection, the eventual paranoia. Childhood had handed her everything, and then yanked it away in the most public fashion possible. It left her determined never to be powerless again. When the storm broke over the Deacon family, it didn't just scatter their reputation across Europe's newspapers, it scattered the children too. Gladys, at the tender age of 11, suddenly found herself transplanted from the boulevards of Paris to the manicured lawns of Newport, Rhode Island. It was a curious reversal of fortunes. The family had gone abroad to bask in European sophistication, and now here was Edward Parker Deacon, disgraced and restless, dragging his daughters back to America as though proximity to the Atlantic might wash the scandal off. Newport was not exactly a punishment, of course. By the late 19th century, it was the summer playground of America's elite, a place where the Vanderbilts built palaces with 70 rooms and then had the audacity to call them cottages. It was where society families arrived each season with more trunks than most people owned possessions, and where an invitation to the right lawn party could determine your entire social standing. If Paris had been the stage of Belle Époque elegance, Newport was its American sequel, brasher, newer, but no less determined to dazzle. For Gladys and her sisters, this was now home. Edward Deacon, still clinging to the remnants of his dignity, installed them in fine surroundings, saw to their education, and continued to parade them as his proudest trophies. If he could not control his wife, he would control his daughters, and if he could not dominate Paris, then at least he could dominate Newport drawing rooms. It was here that Gladys's gifts began to reveal themselves in earnest. No longer just a precocious little girl with ribbons in her hair, she was now an adolescent whose combination of intelligence and beauty drew notice wherever she went. Tutors were astonished. She mastered languages the way other teenagers mastered eye rolls, without effort, without mercy, and with a speed that left grown men flustered. By the time she was grown, she could speak French, Italian, German, Spanish, and of course, English, with a fluency that made her the envy of every hostess looking for a dazzling conversationalist. Her father insisted on the best schooling money could buy. Gladys was tutored privately in literature, history, philosophy, and the arts. She could recite long passages of poetry, play the piano with elegance and debate the finer points of Homeric translations, all before some of her peers had even figured out how to keep their gloves clean at a tea party. Teachers sometimes described her not as clever, but as brilliant. And while brilliance was not always considered an asset in young women, too much wit could make a girl difficult in the marriage market. It made Gladys unforgettable. At the same time, her beauty was blossoming. The blue-green eyes that would later entrance Proust were already startling. Her features were symmetrical, her skin flawless, her carriage graceful. Visitors to the Deacon household often left with remarks about that extraordinary child, a phrase that would follow her into adulthood, half admiration, half warning. Of course, beneath the polished exterior, life was less than perfect. Edward Parker Deacon, though wealthy, was hardly the picture of stability. His temper, once merely volatile, began to unravel into genuine instability. His paranoia deepened, his mood swung wildly, and by the late 1890s his behaviour had grown so erratic that whispers began about his sanity. By 1899 he was committed to McLean Hospital for the insane in Massachusetts, where he died in 1901. For Gladys, this was a wound that never fully healed. She adored her father, even when his grip on reality faltered, and his eventual institutionalization terrified her. She inherited not only his fortune, but also the gnawing fear that she might one day inherit his madness. It was a fear that clung to her throughout her life, a shadow behind every glittering triumph. And yet, even as these personal tragedies unfolded, Gladys was learning to play the part she had been trained for since childhood. Newport society, like Parisian salons, demanded performance. Young women were expected to sparkle at dinner tables, to glide through dances, to speak just enough to seem clever, but not so much as to seem threatening. Gladys, however, was never one to play small. She spoke her mind, displayed her intelligence, and carried herself with a confidence that unsettled some and intrigued many. Dry humour here practically writes itself. Imagine a teenage girl today, showing up at a summer camp, already fluent in 5 languages, quoting Goethe and playing Chopin while everyone else is just figuring out TikTok. That was Gladys in Newport, dazzling, intimidating, and entirely unwilling to dim her light for the comfort of others. But if her intellect was formidable, her beauty was undeniable. It was the kind of beauty that was not simply pleasant to look at, but arresting. Men stumbled over sentences in her presence. Women found themselves both fascinated and faintly uneasy. Beauty alone can be a weapon, but beauty sharpened by intelligence. That was dynamite. Gladys was becoming a social force before she had even come of age. Her circle expanded beyond Newport. Summers might be spent on the lawns of Rhode Island, but winters could include travel, Boston, New York, and eventually, once she was older, a return to Europe. With each new encounter, her reputation grew. She was no longer just the child of scandal, but the young woman who seemed to embody brilliance, tragedy, and allure all in one package. And perhaps that was her true inheritance, not just her father's fortune, but the intoxicating cocktail of beauty touched by tragedy. Society loves nothing more than a woman who appears both enviable and doomed. It is a narrative as old as Helen of Troy, and as modern as a celebrity tabloid. And Gladys, whether she liked it or not, was slipping into that role. By the time Edward died in 1901, leaving Gladys effectively orphaned, she was fully formed as a figure of fascination. A wealthy, brilliant, beautiful young woman with a tragic backstory. In the salons of Paris and London, this was less a person and more a ticket to immortality. Artists sought her face. Writers sought her company. Aristocrats sought her hand. She had every advantage, money, looks, intellect, but also every danger, pride, perfectionism, and the shadow of inherited madness. What remained now was to see how she would wield these gifts, and whether she could master them before they mastered her. By the time Gladys Deacon was 20, she had lived through enough drama to fill several serialised novels, the kind where each instalment ends with a cliffhanger and a new scandal splashed across the front page. Her father's downward spiral had ended with his death in 1901 at McLean Hospital, the Massachusetts asylum where Boston society discreetly tucked away its embarrassments. For Gladys, it was both a release and a haunting. She was free of his volatility, but now carried the dread that his instability might be lurking somewhere in her own blood. And then there was her mother, Florence Baldwin Deacon, elegant, stubborn, and scandal-stained, had been branded by the French affair that ended in gunfire. While Edward had technically been the criminal, Florence had been the woman whose desires caused whispers in every salon from Paris to Cannes. Society rarely forgave a woman for loving unwisely, and Florence found herself marked. Divorce, scandal, humiliation, the holy trinity of social exile. Florence, however, refused to vanish quietly. After the divorce, she drifted between Europe and America, determined to salvage her standing. She still had beauty, she still had connections, and she was still the daughter of an admiral, and in society's bizarre arithmetic, that pedigree was enough to keep her in circulation. But Florence's greatest influence in these years may have been the lesson she inadvertently taught her daughter, that reputation could be destroyed in a single misstep, and that beauty was both currency and curse. Gladys, meanwhile, had emerged from her Newport years not just unscathed, but sharpened. She was now an heiress fluent in multiple languages, with dazzling intelligence and the kind of tragic backstory that made her irresistible. By 1902 she had returned to Europe, and the salons of Paris, London and Rome greeted her like a comet, beautiful, brilliant, and trailed by whispers of scandal. It was a potent combination. In a society addicted to surfaces, Gladys offered not just beauty, but depth. Men who expected a pretty face were startled to find a conversationalist who could spar with them in French, quote philosophy in German, and then switch to English wit sharp enough to draw blood. The great art critic Bernard Berenson once fell so under her spell that he contemplated leaving his wife for her. His wife Mary summed her up neatly: beautiful, cruel, selfish, untrained. What will become of her? It was not just admiration but alarm. Gladys was dazzling, yes, but also unsettling. The kind of woman who could charm a room and then gut it with a single cutting remark. And she had that greatest of Belle Époque assets, her eyes. Blue-green, luminous, described again and again by contemporaries as unforgettable. Artists begged to capture them. Writers spilled ink over them. Marcel Proust himself, not exactly short on muses, wrote with awe of Gladys's beauty, wit, and goodness. Imagine being the subject of Proust's infatuation. It was the early 1900s, equivalent of trending on every platform at once, but instead of likes, you got immortalization in French literature. Her reputation spread quickly. Giovanni Boldini, the celebrated portraitist of high society, painted her more than once, producing canvases in which she appears all luminous silk and feline poise. Sculptor Auguste Rodin presented her with one of his works as a tribute, which is not the kind of gift one hands out lightly. Later, Jacob Epstein would immortalize her features in marble, though time would make the contrast between sculpture and reality all the more tragic. At the time, though, Gladys was the very definition of a muse, that rare creature whose presence seemed to unlock creativity in others. Dry humour alert. Imagine if today's most influential painter, novelist, and sculptor all became obsessed with the same Instagram model. That was Gladys, except instead of hashtags and filters, she had wit, intelligence, and a pair of eyes that made grown men rethink their marriages. Her mother Florence hovered on the periphery of this new chapter. No longer the dazzling hostess of her youth, Florence became the cautionary tale Gladys tried desperately not to become. For Gladys, every triumph carried the whisper of warning. Beauty fades, scandal clings, madness lurks. If Florence had lost everything in pursuit of desire, Gladys would try to win everything by controlling hers. And win she did, at least for a time. By her mid-20s, she had become a fixture in the elite circles of Paris and London. Princes courted her, dukes admired her, and intellectuals argued over her at dinner tables. She was not merely present, she was magnetic, the kind of figure whose entrance changed the energy of a room. Some saw only the surface, the perfect gowns, the radiant face. Others saw the sharpness underneath, the tragic inheritance, the vulnerability hidden behind her poise. All of it combined to make her unforgettable. It was in these years that Gladys also began to display her contradictions. She was fiercely independent, yet craved recognition. She was intellectual, yet obsessed with her appearance. She wielded her beauty like a weapon, but was already beginning to worry it was slipping. These tensions would eventually consume her, but in the early 1900s, they only made her more fascinating. Her brilliance and allure, her tragic backstory, her difficult mother, her dead father, all of it made Gladys more than just another pretty socialite. She was drama incarnate, wrapped in silk and crowned with blue-green eyes. Europe had seen beautiful women before. What it had rarely seen was beauty so sharpened by intellect and shadowed by tragedy. It was intoxicating, and it was only the beginning. By the first decade of the 20th century, Gladys Deacon had perfected the art of being unforgettable. It wasn't only her beauty, though that was the starting point. It was the way she carried it, sharpened with intellect, laced with wit, and wrapped in just enough tragedy to make her feel more like a novel than a person. Artists, sculptors, and writers didn't just admire her, they felt compelled to capture her, as though if they didn't, she might vanish like a dream. The first to fall hard was Giovanni Boldini, the Italian painter who was society's most celebrated portraitist. Boldini specialised in glamour. Silk gowns captured mid-swish, elegant women painted with the energy of a ballroom. But when he painted Gladys in 1908, something different happened. The result, now hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, shows her with luminous skin, piercing eyes, and a sense of aloof command. It's not the portrait of a debutante, it's the portrait of a woman who knows the room is already hers. Boldini painted her more than once, and each time she seemed less like a sitter and more like a subject claiming the canvas. Then came the sculptors. Auguste Rodin, already a legend for works like The Thinker, presented Gladys with one of his creations as a token of admiration. The kind of gesture that suggests her magnetism wasn't limited to conversational charm. Jacob Epstein, another giant of the sculptural world, carved her likeness into marble in 1917, producing a bust so refined it seemed to whisper of her beauty long after her features themselves began to fade. It was as if the artists understood what time would eventually do and were determined to preserve her before the inevitable decay of both flesh and reputation. And then, of course, there was Marcel Proust. If Boldini captured her in paint and Epstein in stone, Proust captured her in words. And words, after all, last the longest. Proust was famously captivated by women who embodied both beauty and mystery, and Gladys fit the bill perfectly. He praised not just her looks but her intellect, writing that he had never seen a girl with such beauty, such magnificent intelligence, such goodness and charm. For a man who made a career of dissecting the subtleties of human desire, that was no small compliment. Imagine today's equivalent, a novelist winning the Nobel Prize and still writing love letters to someone he met at a dinner party. Gladys wasn't just inspiring, She was distracting genius itself. Critics and thinkers followed suit. Bernard Berenson, one of the most influential art historians of the age, was so enthralled he nearly abandoned his wife for her. His wife Mary, less enchanted, wrote about Gladys in her diary with a mixture of awe and alarm. Beautiful, cruel, selfish, untrained. What will become of her? It was the eternal question. Was Gladys dazzling or dangerous? The answer, of course, was both. Dry humour practically bubbles here. If today's equivalent of Gladys walked into a gallery opening, she'd leave with the top fashion photographer begging to shoot her, a best-selling novelist writing thinly veiled tributes, and an art historian ruining his marriage because he couldn't stop sketching her profile on cocktail napkins. Gladys was that irresistible. Her eyes, those famous blue-green eyes, were the key. People couldn't stop talking about them. Painters tried to replicate their depth. Poets compared them to oceans, and sculptors etched their shape into marble. At Blenheim Palace years later, the Duke of Marlborough would even have them painted into the ceiling. Two enormous eyes staring down from above, as if to remind everyone of the woman who once ruled him. They weren't just beautiful, they were symbols, hypnotic and unsettling in equal measure. But Gladys wasn't content to be admired in silence. She wielded her position as muse with intelligence. She conversed with artists about their work, critiqued their choices, and sometimes inserted herself into their creative process. She wasn't the silent subject reclining on a couch waiting to be painted. She was the lively, opinionated collaborator who might argue about brushstrokes or suggest an alternative pose. Some found this exhilarating, others found it maddening. But no one forgot it. Her reputation spread beyond the studios and salons. She became known not just as the most painted woman of her time, but as a cultural phenomenon, an heiress who wasn't content to simply look pretty, but insisted on being clever, sharp, and sometimes cruel. She was beautiful enough to be adored, but intelligent enough to unsettle those who adored her. That combination ensured that wherever she went, whispers followed, half admiration, half warning. And yet, even as she basked in this adoration, shadows lurked. Gladys was acutely aware that her beauty was her greatest asset, and she began to fear its fragility. She studied classical statuary in Roman museums, obsessively measuring proportions of Greek profiles, convinced that perfection was a science she could master. It was the beginning of a dangerous fixation. If her beauty was the key to her power, then any flaw, however small, was a threat. For the moment, though, she was still untouchable. Her mother's disgrace and her father's madness had receded into background whispers, overshadowed by her own brilliance. In her 20s, she was not the daughter of scandal, but the woman every artist wanted to capture, every intellectual wanted to debate, every aristocrat wanted to court. Europe's cultural elite, so often jaded, found in Gladys Deacon a shock of vitality, a woman who was as compelling in conversation as she was in repose, as intimidating as she was alluring. She wasn't just in the room, she was the room. For most people, being called the most beautiful woman in Europe would be enough. It's the kind of accolade you could coast on for years, dropping it into conversation whenever the subject of accomplishments came up. But Gladys Deacon was not most people. Her beauty was not simply a gift, it was a weapon, a burden, and eventually an obsession. The trouble began with her love of classical art. Gladys, remember, was not only admired for her looks but for her intellect. She spent hours in museums in Rome and Paris, studying Greek and Roman statues with the same intensity that other young women studied fashion plates. Where others saw marble goddesses, Gladys saw rulers of proportion, ratios, measurements, and ideals. She brought notebooks, rulers, and an almost scientific devotion to the subject. To her, beauty wasn't just in the eye of the beholder, it was math. Her particular fixation, the Greek profile, She wanted the straight, unbroken line from forehead to nose to tip, the kind that looked carved rather than born. It was, she believed, the ultimate proof of perfection. And while to the rest of the world Gladys's face already bordered on flawless, she herself saw something intolerable, a tiny indentation between her nose and forehead. To anyone else it was invisible. To Gladys it was ruinous. Now most people confronted with a minor flaw might sigh, adjust their hairstyle, and move on. But Gladys was no ordinary heiress. She was already the muse of painters and poets. She'd already seen her eyes painted onto ceilings and her profile etched in marble. For her, one small imperfection wasn't just vanity, it was a crack in the empire she had built. And then came the worst possible temptation, science, or at least what passed for cosmetic science in the early 1900s. This was the infancy of plastic surgery. Surgeons were experimenting with materials and techniques that today would make any dermatologist shudder. Among the most fashionable procedures was the injection of paraffin wax into soft tissue to correct minor irregularities. The theory was simple enough. Melted wax was injected beneath the skin, where it would harden and fill in gaps, smoothing profiles and plumping features. The practice, however, was as risky as it sounds. Wax shifts, wax melts, and wax inside the human body is about as stable as wax on a summer sidewalk. Gladys, however, was enchanted. In 1903, at just 22, she underwent the procedure. A surgeon injected paraffin wax into her nose, carefully moulding it to erase the indentation and create the perfect Greek line she had studied so obsessively. At first, the results seemed dazzling. Photographs from those years show her with a sculpted, almost statuesque profile. Admirers continued to swoon. Artists still begged to paint her. She must have felt triumphant, the goddess perfected by her own hand. But paraffin is fickle. Over time, it began to migrate. Slowly at first, then relentlessly, the wax slipped from its original position. Instead of staying neatly between forehead and nose, it drifted downward into her cheeks and jaw, hardening into grotesque lumps. The effect was cruel. The very face that had captivated Europe began to warp into a mask of distortion. Imagine being the muse of Boldini, the subject of Proust's adoration, the woman's sculptors compared to marble, and then watching your features slowly betray you. It was not a bad photograph, or a cruel newspaper cartoon. It was her own face changing daily, as if mocking her obsession. The irony was brutal. In trying to perfect herself according to the ideals of antiquity, she had instead condemned herself to a slow-motion disfigurement. The gods she had idolized in marble had punished her with wax. Dry humour fits here, though it has an edge. It's as if someone obsessed with Instagram filters decided to edit their face permanently, only to discover that the filter had a mind of its own, and kept updating long after the app was closed. At first, Gladys tried to ignore it. She compensated with cleverness, with gowns, with the force of her personality. And for a while she succeeded. Men still courted her, artists still painted her, society still admired her. But she knew. Each morning the mirror confirmed it. Her triumph was slipping. Worse still, she could not stop herself. She'd always been a perfectionist, always demanded more beauty, more recognition, more control. And once she had tampered with nature, the obsession deepened. She returned again and again to the statues, to the ratios, as if she could measure her way out of disfigurement. Friends noticed a change. She was still dazzling, still brilliant, but now there was a sharpness beneath the charm, a desperation behind the wit, the cruel streak that Mary Berenson had noted years before. Beautiful, cruel, selfish, grew more pronounced. Gladys could eviscerate rivals with a remark, laugh too loudly, or brood silently for hours. Beauty had once been her crown. Now it was her battlefield. And here lies the deeper tragedy. Gladys's fixation wasn't born only of vanity, it was born of trauma. She had watched her father unravel into madness, terrified she might follow. She had grown up under the shadow of scandal, determined to be invulnerable. Beauty and intellect had been her shields. But if beauty faltered, if even a fraction of her allure slipped, then everything she had built might collapse. Her mother's fate loomed too. Florence Baldwin Deacon had been a celebrated beauty once, only to be reduced to whispers and humiliation. Gladys was determined not to become another Florence, and yet, by trying to defy the fragility of beauty, she'd unknowingly set herself on a similar path. The paraffin wax hardened, the whispers grew, and though she was still courted, still admired, still powerful in salons, Gladys was already on the edge of tragedy. It is tempting to call this moment the beginning of her downfall, but in truth, the seeds had been planted long before, in childhood trauma, in the weight of expectations, in the intoxicating mix of brilliance and insecurity. The wax injection was merely the visible symptom of an inner struggle that had been brewing all along. Still, history is cruel with its symbols, and for Gladys Deacon, the symbol was clear. A woman once compared to Greek goddesses had been undone by trying to become one. By the 1960s, Gladys Deacon had lived through the rise, the glory, and the ruin of her own legend. Once the most painted woman of her time, the muse of Rodin and Boldini, the obsession of Proust, she was by then a recluse in patched boots, feeding spaniels and muttering to strangers on the telephone. But eccentricity eventually hardened into something darker. Neighbours whispered of her wandering at night, her strange outbursts, her growing paranoia. In 1962, at the age of 81, authorities decided they could no longer ignore the risk she posed to herself and others. Gladys was committed to St Andrew's Hospital in Northampton, a psychiatric institution where she would remain until her death. To the outside world she was gone, vanished from the society pages that had once chronicled her every move. Inside St Andrew's, she lived quietly, still reading voraciously, still intellectually sharp in moments, but also increasingly detached from her own identity. The most chilling detail came from the biographer Hugo Vickers, who visited her more than 60 times in her final years. When he once asked her gently, "Where is Gladys Deacon?" she replied slowly, "Gladys Deacon never existed." It was a devastating answer. The woman who had once bent Europe's cultural elite to her orbit now denied she had ever been. Beauty, brilliance, ambition, obsession, all erased in her own mind, leaving only the void. She died in 1977 at the age of 96, in the psycho-geriatric ward of St Andrews. No family surrounded her, no admirers filled her room. Her death went largely unnoticed outside small circles of historians and biographers. For a woman who had once lived under chandeliers, it was a lonely end. And yet, she left behind ghosts. The Sphinx sculptures at Blenheim Palace, still bearing her features, gaze enigmatically across the gardens. The blue-green eyes she had painted on the ceiling still stare down at visitors, reminders of a beauty that once ruled those halls. Her portraits hang in museums, her likeness frozen forever in marble and oil paint. More perfect than any paraffin injection could have made her. Her life is a cautionary tale, but also a strangely modern one. In an age when perfection is pursued with filters, fillers and surgeries, Gladys's story feels uncomfortably familiar. She was undone, not by a lack of beauty, but by the terror of losing it. She tried to measure herself against statues and ideals, and lost herself in the process. Perhaps that is why her story lingers. Gladys Deacon embodies the paradox of the Gilded Age, dazzling on the surface, cracked beneath, and obsessed with appearances until the end. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please tap the like button, Subscribe for more journeys into the quieter corners of history, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these tales are keeping you company. Until next time, sleep well, dream of forgotten beauties and candlelit ballrooms, and I'll see you in the next story. Script written by Clara Finch, because good stories always deserve a soul.